Morning, everyone. How you doing? So glad that you're here today, whether that's in person or online. We're glad and thankful as we dive into our continued series looking at some statements Jesus made about himself that really matter on a core level. We get to understand who Jesus is and then maybe see how that impacts the way that we view Jesus and how can we be shaped by some of the things that he knew to be true about him. I've got a question as we start today. I want an honest answer, and if you have ever done this, I need you to stand up and then claim that you've done this. Okay? So here's what we're going to do. The question is, have you ever built a fence? Now, if you have built a fence, I want you to stand up and say, I have built a fence. Okay, perfect. Handful of you have built a fence before. Wonderful. You can stay seated. That's awesome. For those of you who have never built a fence, you have missed out on the privilege that it is to erect something. And the purpose of a fence is multifaceted. We build fences to keep people out. Yeah? Has anybody ever built a fence to keep somebody out of a certain space? Around my garden, I build a fence because I love rabbits when they don't eat my vegetables. And chipmunks, right? We build a fence to keep people out. We also build fences to keep people in. If you've ever been a parent, you know a fence you might have used around your staircase called the baby gate. It's a fence that you put up to keep your kid in, so they don't tumble headfirst down the stairs, or they don't run out when you're using the washroom, or anything like that. We build fences. Does anybody know the most important part of a fence? The gate. I agree. You can build a fence, but if you have something that you can't walk through or get through, it's just a wall. It's just a space that takes up real estate. It loses its purpose without a gate, without some sort of opening. I remember building a fence the first time. I was about 8 years old. It was a multi-generational project in the Frizzell family household. My grandfather, my uncle, my dad, myself. And we were building this fence. And when it came to the gate, the rest of the fence took so much time to put up. Most of it, 2/3 of the day. But the gate took the longest. We had to measure, be meticulous. And at some point, my grandfather and my father may have yelled at one another because the gate wasn't aligning with the envision of the whole entire fence itself. The most important part of a fence is a gate, and this is a statement that Jesus makes about himself, referring to himself as a gate. And we're going to study that intentionally and then identify 3 things around what he's saying that might be helpful for us to incorporate into our everyday lives. If you got a Bible, I want to invite you to turn with me to the book of John chapter 10. I'm going to read the first 10 verses, and then we'll dissect this text, and we will see what God has in mind for us to learn from the truth that is spoken through his word, Jesus Christ. I tell you the truth, anyone who sneaks over the wall of a sheepfold rather than going through the gate must surely be a thief and a robber. But the one who enters through the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep recognize his voice and come to him. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. After he has gathered his own flock, he walks ahead of them, and they follow him because they know his voice. They won't follow a stranger. They will run from him because they don't know his voice. Those who heard Jesus use this illustration didn't understand what he meant. So he explained it to them. I tell you the truth. I am the gate for the sheep. All who came before me were thieves and robbers, but the true sheep did not listen to them. Yes, I am the gate. Those who come in through me will be saved. They will come and go freely and find good pastures. The thief's purpose is to steal and kill and destroy. My purpose is to give them a rich and satisfying life. These are the words that Jesus utters about being a gate. And as I mentioned, there's three kind of aspects of what he's saying here that I want to dive into. The first is really simple. It's the gate itself. It's a symbolic reference to so many things that he is articulating in this space. I've got a photo of a temple that I want to show you. This was the epicenter of the Jewish community, the nation of Israel, the place where they would go and celebrate, the place they would go and worship. It was a place that represented commerce at times, money exchanging, offerings, all sorts of stuff. It was built meticulously with a whole bunch of specific instructions on what things represented what aspects of God's love or nature, how to worship him in a multifaceted way. This space had gates, and only certain people were allowed through certain gates. There was restricted areas in the space. In this small little photo, what you'll see is there's kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different gates in the space. And as I mentioned, each one of them represents a layer of access. If you were from a particular tribe, you could go through a certain portion of the gate. If you happened to be a man, you could go a little bit further into the temple. There was a space that was restricted. Women couldn't enter into there. Children couldn't enter into there. If you were part of the priesthood, you could go into another part of the space that the public didn't have access to. And if you were chosen, you could find yourself in the most intimate space of the temple itself, in what was referred to as the Holy of Holies, all through going through a series of various gates. Jesus says in this statement that he is the gate. He says, I am the gate. I'm the one who allows people to enter and exit. He's making a declaration here that our rules, our regulations, our traditions, even our ideologies aren't the things that exclude or include people. It's Jesus and Jesus alone that grants full access to who God is. Now, we could say that, but I think we can wrestle with that a little bit further. It's one thing to say that Jesus is the only one that can decide, but there are times where you and I decide all the time for people. You think about our culture today. One of the challenges that we have in our region is with our transient homeless or home-challenged population. And many of us are involved in various ways of caring for them. Sometimes we work at Loaves and Fishes and do meal access. Sometimes we volunteer at the John Howard Society and do some employment education consulting of some kind, or some helps in that way. But sometimes when we're in line or we're walking downtown King Street here in Brockville and we see a group of people that looks a little bit different than us, that dresses a little bit different than us, that maybe even smells a little bit different than us, we don't necessarily engage. We don't necessarily engage with them as humans. Instead, we just see them as a problem that needs to be managed. Right in that moment, we create a gate, a degree of separation. I am human, you're something else. We can do this with a gender bias. We can do this with age bias. We can do this subconsciously time after time after time. Because as human beings, we are fascinated with the idea of who is in and who is out. How do we create space and environments where we can feel comfortable, but if somebody's going to break our comfort level, then I want to erect a fence to keep them out. Happens on a political world stage. We had a presidential candidate run on the mantra of building a fence to keep people out of their country. This happens all over the place. And I find it interesting that Jesus says, listen, I am the gate. He's the one that determines who has full access. So why do we spend our time, why do we waste our energy trying to identify who's in and who's out? Why do we spin our tires like that? Why do we have arguments like that? On this day, 20 years ago, I asked my wife the most important question that I have ever asked anybody in my lifetime. I asked if she would marry me. And after about a minute and 30 seconds of silence, she said yes. Pretty crazy. And in that moment, we had full access to this adventure of a lifetime that we're still living now 2 decades later. It's a privilege. It's an opportunity. Now, it hasn't always been straightforward, hasn't always been full of daisies and rainbows. It's been challenging along the way. But in each moment, we've had to make a decision to choose one another so that we can flourish, so that we can grow. And we've had to create a gate even in our marriage. Who do we allow to have access and influence? Do we let Jesus speak into it and shape what it's going to look like? Or do we trust our own abilities? When Jesus is saying that he's the gate, what he is trying to help this early community understand is he is the one that determines who is worthy of love. He's the one. And the reality is, he thinks everybody's worthy of love. That does not mean that everybody will choose to receive his gift of love and that everybody is universally saved just because of Jesus. You have to choose to follow Jesus to walk in salvation. But he's referring to the reality that our systems, our structures, our values, they aren't the ones that keep people in or keep people out. It's Jesus and Jesus alone. So when you read once again in your future reading of the scriptures where Jesus says, I am the gate, I want you to hear, I am full access. I am full access. Jesus saying, hey, when people want to know what life is all about, I am that conduit. I provide full access. Not morality, not laws, not policies, me and me alone. Jesus is full access. He's the gate. There's a second thing that this text talks about, which is really interesting, that I think it's worth mentioning and highlighting for the next few moments. I believe it's in verse 5 or 6. Talks about Jesus allowing people to come and go in a good pastures, green pastures. I want to ask you a question. How many of you have grown up on a farm or around a farm? Quick show of hands. What is your favorite farm animal? A goat. Anybody agree? A horse? Cows? Chickens? Anything else? Sheep? Ducks. Okay, lots of animals. Nobody has said my favorite animal yet. Somebody just said it. Pigs. Pigs are my favorite farm animal. Do you know why? Bacon is one reason, yes. Amen to that. In fact, if you had the chance to listen to one of our podcast episodes where we welcomed one of our newer staff members, Heather, onto the team, we posed a question to her and her husband about what animal they would choose to be, and they had various answers. Russ said he was going to be a shark, so I was like, ooh, that's scary. I said I was going to be a pig because I was like, what better that gift to give the world than bacon? I don't know. Now, pigs are really interesting. If you've ever spent time around pigs, they are smelly, they are destructive, they love to roll around and create mud pits, they love to eat. The crazy thing about a pig is they will eat anything. They will eat pineapple. It's true. Just not on pizza. Yes, that's also true. They will eat anything. My uncle had pigs on his farm, and what we would do, we would save all sorts of table scraps in a big bucket, and you just throw it in the pen, and they would eat whatever was provided. I was thinking about this whole idea of Jesus letting people migrate to and fro through the gate into green pastures. He's providing sustenance for people. He's providing an opportunity for them to feast right where he has placed them, right with what's in front of them. The challenge is, more often than not, we are not like pigs. We're a little bit more choosy when it comes to what we eat, literally and figuratively. Sometimes when Jesus leads us to an environment and a space, we struggle with it. We go, you know what? I think that's a good idea conceptually, but I definitely don't want to eat from the place that you've led me to. It is not my preference. We have the audacity to say this to the gatekeeper who has provided for us not only a way to have full access to our Creator, but also provision. And we can look at what he's provided and say, it's just not enough. I want a little bit more, or I want a little bit less. If you've ever had a picky individual in your family when it comes to food, you know what I'm talking about. Where if a fleck of pepper ends up on an egg, they won't eat it because the whole entity is now contaminated. It's a tension and it's a challenge. And I get it. Allergies are real. That's not what I'm referring to. But Jesus, when he provides for us, isn't going to lead us to a space that will not nourish our souls. There's some bad theology that floats around in our world. Theology that says that God wounds us, that God inflicts pain on us. That's a misunderstanding of who God is. We live in a broken world. God, in his sovereignty and his mercy and his infinite knowledge, created a world that was perfect. And we as human beings rejected that perfection, instead choosing to create a lesser version of our own experience called life. That's when brokenness and sin entered the world, marring and distorting what God created. So anything that we experience now is less than what he intended. There are really excellent, great moments overlapped inside of it, but there is still a gap. There's still a gap. We don't get to experience that fullness and the richness until we follow Jesus into those environments and into those spaces. God doesn't wound us. God uses the brokenness, the sin, the challenges, the suffering in our world to help us grow. So I know in our emotional state and response, it's easy for us to say that God wounds us, that God hurts us, that God harms us. That couldn't be further from the truth. In the book of Jeremiah, there's a promise that Jesus gives. God gives to the community of Israel. It's in chapter 29, verse 11. He says, I have plans to prosper you, to give you a hope and a future, not to harm you. The context of that promise was God gave that originally to the first group of people that he set apart from all the rest of humankind to follow him, to be a symbol of hope to the world around them, the Israelites. And they had gone through hardship after hardship after hardship, being slaves, being subordinate to another culture, losing a piece of their identity, time and time again, walking through tragedy after tragedy after tragedy, and in desperation, they're crying out to God saying, you are doing this to me, what the heck? And he fires back with that promise. I promise, I have a plan for you, to help you prosper, to give you hope and a future, not to harm you. So why is it when Jesus leads us to a place where we can feast, a pasture of some kind, we refuse to eat? You know why? Because we actually don't trust that God isn't going to harm us. Somewhere deep down inside, we just don't believe it. We panic. We say, listen, I feel like I'm in a desert right now, and you're asking me to drink of this water, and it looks green. There's some microbials in there that might harm me. But there's nothing else to eat. Can we just feast where he brings us, where he leads us? Can we trust that he knows what he's doing? Even in the midst of the pain and the hardship, the unanswered questions, the frustrations, the suffering? Can we feast? This past week I had the privilege of presiding over a funeral of one of our Sea Road legends, John Simpson. Now, John, if he was here, he'd tell you he was not a perfect man in any way, shape, or form. He probably could give you a list of ways where he fell short. But the one thing that I admired most about my friend John is even in the midst of suffering, he chose Jesus, and he chose to feast. When John retired from working, he had an ideal of how his life was going to go. He'd enjoy the retirement years, have lots of margin and energy, probably serve a whole bunch more here at Sea Road. If you've ever used the washrooms in the first part of the facility in the kids' areas, John played a role in stitching those together. Truth is, though, he started to have some health challenges. One setback after one setback after one setback after one setback. If anybody would have had license to complain, to be frustrated, to be bitter, to refuse to eat from the pasture that God had led him to be in, it would be John. You know why? Because if I was in a situation, I probably would have done that. Been embittered, frustrated, angry. Why are you doing this to me? But John flipped the script. Instead, he used his suffering, feasted on it, and used it as an opportunity to love the people around him. His last days at BGH, his goal was to create an oasis or sanctuary in his hospital room. Caregivers, visitors, doctors, nurses, PSWs, nutritionists, anybody that came into his environment in his space, he wanted them to leave more encouraged than when they entered. That's a prime living example of somebody who knew how to eat from where God had placed him. He was in pain. He was in challenging situations. And in some moments probably was struggling with this idea of even dignity in the way people would have to serve him so he could function. And yet he chose to live in Jesus' words from this text, understanding that Jesus is the gate and Jesus will provide those satiating pastures even in the most challenging of environments. So maybe we need to reframe the moment that we're in if we are feeling a little bit heavy and weighed down by circumstances around us. Open your eyes. Where is Jesus inviting you to feast? Because there is a good pasture in the middle of that chaos. How do I know that? Because God's plan is not to harm you, but to provide for you, giving you a hope and a future even in the chaos. The last thing that I want to do is I want to look at verse 10 in this text because I think it will be really helpful to us to understand the dichotomy at play Verse 10 says this, the thief's purpose is to steal and kill and destroy. My purpose, Jesus speaking, my purpose is to give them a rich and satisfying life. So I want to talk to you about the difference between stealing, killing, and destroying and what it means to live in a rich and satisfying life. Let's talk about rich and satisfying for just a moment. When you hear the word rich, how many of you think money? There's like 4 of us that are being honest. I hear rich, and I think of the comic book, Richie Rich, and I think money. That's not what God is saying here. How many of you think rich in terms of flavor? Yeah. I want you to picture one of the best meals that you've had in your lifetime. Flavorful, filling, the aroma, the essence of it, where you are absolutely salivating at every bite, trying to slow down how you ingest it so that you can truly enjoy every stitch of what is before you. That's what Jesus is referring to in terms of rich. Listen, we're going to go through the challenges and be met with fiscal moments where we don't know what to do. Maybe that's when gas rises to $1.90. Maybe that's when rent increases. Maybe that's when grocery prices are going even more insane than they are in the moment. God does not promise He's going to give you more money, but He does promise a flavorful experience along the way that will nourish you. That's why He links that word with satisfying. He links that word with satisfying, rich and satisfying. You can't separate it. Because after that meal that has been so delicious that you just enjoy every single bite, you sit back and you marvel at how amazing that was until the bill comes. And then you're praying another prayer. So when Jesus says rich and satisfying, He does not promise easy and light work. But He does promise that He'll be with you in those spaces. Alternatively, the enemy, and Jesus calls it out, says this is what the enemy is going to do. This is what an anti-Jesus movement looks like. It's going to kill something in you. It's going to destroy something in you. It's going to steal something from you. And so in the moments of our lives where we feel like something's being taken from us, stolen from us, destroyed in us, that is not God at work. That is the enemy. Now, I'm sure that all of us have experienced a high and low moment. And I'm not advocating that we always ignore what's happening to us emotionally, because there's ebbs and flows in life. You might be watching your favorite sports team and be exhilarated in one moment and frustrated in the next. What I'm referring to with killing and stealing and destroying is your state of mind and your mental well-being and your spiritual well-being. You might be in a season of your life where, man, you feel so close to God. It feels like you wake up in the morning and He's right beside you, waiting and anticipating to walk your day with you. You could see mini miracle after mini miracle after mini miracle in terms of provision, healing, sustenance, answered prayers all around you. And you can celebrate all that. And there are times where we can live into that reality, but more often than not, when that starts to happen in our lives, there's an enemy that does not want to see that germinate and develop fruit inside of you. And so he will do whatever it takes to kill and steal and destroy what Jesus is planting inside of you. You might have had a great conversation with a coworker at work. maybe about spiritual things, maybe just about life. Maybe you got to share a piece of your value system as a follower of Jesus. And then the next day you get called into your boss's office and you get put on some sort of suspension for something you did or didn't do. Somebody made a complaint about you. That circumstance isn't God trying to harm you. That circumstance is the enemy trying to discourage you from following Jesus. You walk through that gate because Jesus gives you full access. Doesn't mean the bully on the other side can't keep tormenting you, chastising you, calling you names, discouraging you, frustrating you, belittling you. Because that's what the enemy does. And the challenge for us as followers of Jesus is to stay present in the moment and recognize when the voice of the enemy starts to speak so that we can rest on what we know to be true. Jesus is the gate, the one who grants access. We can trust in what he says and what he does, even when it doesn't always make sense. Even when we find ourselves more bewildered than certain. Because the voice of Jesus is a voice that leads us to freedom. The voice of the enemy is a voice that leads us into depravity or slavery. This week, I want to challenge you, and I want to challenge myself in this regard. How do we apply this to our lives? First of all, it's a simple question. Where are you at with Jesus? If you're following Jesus, you're not just a fan of Jesus, not thinking Jesus is a good idea, he's a good moral person, whatever. If you're following Christ, you've got that full access. You're living into that reality of that gate. The next level of application is this. We also function as gates for our own lives and the lives of people around us. Here's what I mean by that. We give access to people and things into our lives. Certain levels, through relationship, through activities, through values, through even fiscal spending. We give access to people and things through those habits. My question is this, and the challenge this week is this. Is there anything in your life that you are giving access to that is killing, stealing, and destroying what Jesus is doing in your life? Because if so, it's time to cut that off. It's time to rip that out. It's time to take all of the effort and the energy that's been devoted to allowing that relationship, that thing, that practice, that habit, that routine, access into your life, and put it where it belongs, on the outside of what God is wanting to do in your life. Whether we like it or not, we all give our lives to something. The invitation that Jesus says and what is right before us is the reality that when we give our lives to him, he's the one that can dictate who has access. And we can trust what he wants to do in us and through us and even around us. So let us, instead of rejecting his overture of love, live into that reality, understanding that even when it feels like discipline, it is still loving. God is moving. God is working. We can trust him. So what are you giving access to your life? Jesus says that he's the gate, and he is trustworthy. Let me pray. Father, over these next few moments, as we contemplate that through song, and then a prayer activity that Desiree will lead us through, Jesus, would we be aware of your invitation here to reject the voice of the enemy, to embrace your voice alone, and to trust that even in the moments where we don't fully understand intellectually or even emotionally, that you're large enough to handle the tension of that space We can bring it to you. We can trust you that in the right moment, at the right time, you will show us the hope and the future you have in mind despite the circumstances that we are enduring in the moment. Would you bless us and protect us? Would you make your face shine upon us, be gracious to us? Would you grant us your favor and your peace? I pray this in your name, Jesus. Amen.